Everybody, thanks for watching, and welcome to Ancient History Part 2. Now, in this DVD, we really got to get into a lot of the ancient histories dealing with the Ptolemies, because when you look at biblical history, the ones that we know they copied off of, you cannot go into ancient history and not talk about the Ptolemies. So when we get into the Maccabees, which Maccabees is in the Apocrypha, remember in the 1880s they took out about 15 books from the Bible. And in those 15 books, you had Maccabees 1 and 2. And you can find them in the Catholic Bible, but in the King James Version, we went for a long time without having Maccabees and 14 other books of the Bible. So when you start to realize that in Maccabees, it's getting into Alexander and the Ptolemies. So when you start to understand the history, when you start to read Daniel, you can look in Daniel and see that in Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies, although in the King James Version, they don't really elaborate on names. You'll get Darius, you'll get Alexander in Maccabees, but not in the King James Version itself. So the whole point is we really have to look at biblical history to see the reason why they kept the Ptolemies out and what all that is really talking about. Okay, now before I forget, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch and purchase and support. I have a lot of new upcoming DVDs coming out, more videos on YouTube as well. But we have to really get into this series to kind of bridge the gap between the history of what happened to Kemet and everything that happened after that that led up to the religion that we see today and everything that we see today. So we're going to pick up back with the Ptolemies and really start to understand that history and everything that took place after that, because a lot of people don't realize that the Ptolemies play a huge role in, establishing the civilizations that we see in the so-called Middle East and Europe today. And when you start to look around at what happened and all the wars that was going on, which we'll get into, I mean, everything makes sense as far as why the Greeks were in power and how they was able to create the Torah and biblical religion as we know it. So we're going to get into that. So now, in part one, we talked about Alexander, and when you start to look back at that time in history, and of course we know everything that happened with ancient Kemet and the Persians coming in there and the Greeks coming in there, and the Greeks really establishing themselves in Kemet and having so many years in there to pull out the information. They are the ones that we really have to pay attention to the most. Now it's crazy because there's no way you can be an historian or a researcher and go back in that time and look at the fact that before Kemet fell, you don't see the Greeks, really dressing like the Egyptians and all that stuff that we seen that I showed you guys from the museum. You don't see all that stuff until after the conquest. So it's as if, they was watching and waiting, really being jealous and really waiting to go in there and to be like the Egyptians and have that knowledge. And it seems like, once they took it, they really embellished themselves within that information and really got a lot out of it. But history-wise, when you go into the Bible, again, there's no way you can have these stories about these ancient times and not mention Alexander. You will not see Alexander mentioned in the King James Version, which is the authorized version. This is the version that they gave us. This is important to understand about the King James Version, how you can't just be, crazy with it and just off look it. You have to really accept this version and why it was given to us, because there's a lot behind it. So when you realize that it does not speak of Alexander in the King James Version, it speaks of Darius, but we don't see nothing about the Ptolemies or Alexander in the King James Version. And as I mentioned before, you have to really know about the Ptolemies if you're talking about biblical history, because they play a huge role. So, as I said, they took out the Apocrypha, or what they call the Deuterocanonical books. The Apocrypha, which is, about 15 books that basically was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the King James Version until about, the 1880s when they took it out. Just all of a sudden took out all of these books, and they said that they wasn't really, as close to the other books, meaning they wasn't as divinely inspired as the other books of the Bible, so they removed them. Now, what makes that suspect and why this is important is because you have Maccabees, which we're going to get into first, Maccabees, which is where it's talking about Alexander. It's talking about the Ptolemies. It's talking about that time. Now, when you read Daniel, as I was talking about before, it's also talking about the Ptolemies and Alexander, but it does not mention their names, which is really suspect. It's, what's going on. So you can see how, as I showed you in part 1, we found the history. We went back and looked at the fact that the Bible's history, talking about what was going on with the Phoenicians in Tyre, what was going on in those lands during that time, and what really happened when Alexander came in there and destroyed that city. We see the actual proven history differs from what it's talking about in biblical history. They don't even mention Alexander, but we know that whole story has to do with him, but it's not in your Bible. But we can see that they clearly is talking about the same thing. And I showed you in part 1 how they mixed it up. How when we go back and find that the hidden meaning is actually telling you who would come into those lands and conquer it. So you see how they switch it up. It's the same thing. So what a lot of religious people do is they go in, they read the Bible, and the ones who do know history understand about the Ptolemies. So a lot of people pick up on the stories and say, you know what, they're talking about the Ptolemies, even though they don't mention them by name. The issue with that is, if you don't go and look at actual history, a lot of people are believing that the story the Bible is putting out is actually real history, when that's not the case. The case is, if you do not look at actual history and what many historians have, agreed upon, then compare it to the Bible, you won't get the truth. So when people see that, the simple fact that, the story exists and that in real history, you have a story. Difference is when you compare the stories, they are different. One is made to fit the biblical version, and one is the actual history. So you have to believe the actual history over the biblical version that is put there to steal, to implant itself into history to give validity to the Bible. But when you look at the stories and see how they differ, then you find the parable. This is how you can see what it's talking about. So as we got into in part 1, it's basically giving us the rise of the European powers, showing us that they are the bloodline of the so-called beast, Satan or what have you. These are the people who are controlling, and they're giving you these hints. As I talk about with the occult, they want this stuff to come out because it's our consciousness basically absorbing this stuff and getting ready to prepare the consciousness of the world for what's to come as far as biblical prophecy. As I said before, they are using our consciousness to create the reality that they want. So you need to get into these black folks' heads, the people who can control this reality, exactly what's going on and who the culprits are and what the story is, so we can have that in us. But it's wrong history when you start to compare it. So they're giving us exactly what they have done and what's going on. And when you compare it to actual history, you can see what's going on. And the simple fact that it's Greek history just gives you more proof that it was the Greeks, as I have been saying, that are the ones that have created these religions. Now, we had the King James Version, and for about 274 years, the Apocrypha was included within the King James Version. Even if you go and look at the original King James 1611 Bible, it has the Apocrypha in there. For them to take it out in 1885, it's like, for what? Why take it out? Now, if you have a King James Version from that time, from the 1800s, you can look in there and see the Apocrypha in there. And now you have to be like really a skeptic about why take it out. What is the point? Now, for a lot of people, the information was growing in the 1800s. A lot of people understood history, and having those stories in there about Alexander is just outright explaining what happened, telling you who the boogeyman is, who the bad guy is. And since we was freed 1865, black people started to get knowledge and started to understand stuff. It was smart for them to take out those books, to take out the Apocrypha. And this way we wouldn't be able to look at it and then go back and look at history and say, well, wait a minute, this is what really happened. Because now, you see, people don't care. It don't matter now. They won. It's all done. So they can put the books back in there, which they have done. And you can read about Alexander. They don't care about none of that stuff because the plan worked. Everything happened now. But now you can look at it and start reading about Alexander and Ptolemy and about the wars of the Diadochi, which we're going to get into. And it's like, so what? It's like a story. But when you're trying to get the truth about the validity of the book, of the Bible, and what actually took place, this is what you got to look at. And we're going to get into all of this because it's really important. And I'm going to tell the story about what happened and what took place during that time, during the wars, and why it's really important that we must look at this history. And the reason why I put out this series is because the history is the important part. Because without the history, we're not going to understand what really took place, and we're not going to know why things are the way that it is. It's a huge, gap in between the fall of Kemet and the rise of the European powers as far as biblical supremacy and with the religions and how they used it to basically, put themselves in positions of power. And when I say, it makes so much sense when you understand, and you're really going to get that understanding when I say the consciousness, our consciousness is what helped them do it. So as I said, if you do not possess the necessary tools, the power to create the reality that you want, you have to control the people who can. So once you instill these beliefs into the African people, and then you send them out there to spread the word, because when the Hebrews are talking about the African Hebrews, the African Jews, yeah, of course, as I said, that's true. And they used them to spread that word and to go out and spread this religious consciousness. And they did it, and it stuck and it spread as we can see it, because it's our consciousness that took it in. And since our consciousness is controlling everything and creating this reality, they used it to put themselves in positions of power and use our religious consciousness to infect the rest of the population with religion. So as I said, they could not leave out Alexander. It's just an insult to any real historian who knows about that time for you to go into the Bible and not see anything about Alexander. This is one of the things, like when I talk about, people who actually know history and who actually read the Bible, and them trying to basically put biblical history into actual real history, the fact that he's not in the King James Version should tell you something when you understand actual history. That how could you not put this man in there? How could you not have a definitive long story about him and Julius Caesar? It's like these two people have to be in there. The Ptolemies have to be in there. You have to speak about certain people to really give the validity to what you're speaking about on something of this magnitude. When you're talking about, the Son of God walking the earth and miracles or what have you, how do you leave this dude out? And the more you understand about how much, the Greeks conquered and what they did, it's an insult. And we don't realize it's an insult because we don't know history. We don't know what really took place. And we don't really get it. So we just go with the flow and what we have been brainwashed to believe as far as biblical history. But when you understand, it's how can you not put them in there? But in our Apocrypha, in First Maccabees, says clear as day. It's talking about Alexander. So it says here, this history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers,
and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen, who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. So this is how we understand how Ptolemy I Soter became king of Egypt, who Ptolemy I Soter was one of his generals. And you start to really understand what was going on around that time. So the reason why, we mention Game of Thrones in this part is because when we go through this, you're going to understand where they got the whole entire concept from. I mean, when you start reading about this time and this history and what was going on between these generals, between these people who split up these kingdoms and had different lands, you see Game of Thrones. I mean, everything that you see, if you watch Game of Thrones, you're really going to understand this. Everything that you see and what's taking place in Game of Thrones is here. The only thing that is missing is dragons, but not really. Not really. Because when you start to understand that in Daniel, it's talking about dragons, as I pointed out, but also in the Apocrypha, one, we have Merkabah, where it's talking about Alexander getting into the Ptolemies, but also part of the Apocrypha, you have the whole story about Bel and the dragons. And in Bel and the Dragons, it's talking about Daniel, which, how fitting, is talking about Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies. So you do have dragons. And as you get into the story, you're going to have female warriors, and you're going to have, the same terminology about king of the north, king of the south, the kingdoms, bending the knee. All of this terminology you hear, you read about when it's talking about ancient Greece and the Ptolemies and everything that happened in the wars of the Diadochi and what took place. It's nowhere around that. Game of Thrones is talking about the Ptolemaic Empire, the Diadochi War, and what was going on back then. Plain and simple. It's nowhere around that to me. The whole thing about Ptolemy being a bastard, same thing with Game of Thrones, all that kind of talk is in the stories when you start reading and getting into it. And as we get into it, you're going to see what I'm talking about, and you can start to point out things. If you're into Game of Thrones, you'll understand exactly what it's saying. So now understand, we're going to get into the story. Now, when Alexander died, of course, the best thing to do, even though he split up the whole territory, started splitting up the kingdoms. And the best thing to do is to try to really take his spot. Everybody knew that when Alexander died, the person who took his spot would be looked at as the true ruler. So even if it was, something that came up with the kingdoms, that they would go to this ruler as being the final decision, the one who has the most power. Because you can't just split up kingdoms and then, have these kingdoms supposed to be full of just Greek people and equal. Somebody still has to rule. Somebody has to be the authority, even though they had kingdoms. So, of course, you're the ruler in your kingdom, but really, the person who would replace Alexander would be looked at as the true king. So, a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra, his sister, when he died. And one of the things you'll understand, do not get caught up in the names. There are many Cleopatras. A lot of people they got this idea that it's one Cleopatra. It's many Cleopatras. There are many Alexanders. There are many Ptolemies. When you start getting into the stories, you'll understand that these names get passed down. Which is why you have Ptolemy the first, second, what have you. Alexander the first, second, fourth, or what have you. Same thing with Cleopatra. So don't get caught up in the names. There's more than one Cleopatra. So a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra to, get that marriage going so they can kind of sort of be the one who was looked at as the main king on the throne. Now, it was rumored that Cleopatra was going to marry Perdiccas, who was one of Alexander's generals. Now, this was a rumor. Now, a lot of people really thought that they actually got married, but it wasn't true. But in any case, the rest of the Diadochi, which Diadochi means successor. So you have the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors of Alexander the Great, basically what it translates as. So, of course, since people hearing this stuff, the other kings, seeing that Perdiccas would probably marry Cleopatra, they came together against Perdiccas. And, even though it wasn't so, but Cleopatra remained single for a while, of course. And the whole thing was when Alexander died, if you remember the story, you understand his brother, Aridaeus, who was his older half brother, was supposed to take the throne. But he was mentally ill. He was slow. He basically was, mentally unfit to rule the kingdom. And, Alexander understood this. He kept Aridaeus with him and took him out to many battles. He kept him by his side. It was his brother. He actually loved his brother a lot. But he knew he was weak and that he was feeble-minded. He wasn't really there 100%. So Alexander wasn't really worried about him. So now Perdiccas was actually named the regent of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. So since they looked at it and said that, well, this dude is slow, we can't really put him as the ruler. We have to elect a regent, which a regent basically means somebody who's going to basically be ruling in place until the heir becomes of age. Because remember, Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant. And the whole thing was, would she produce a man or a woman? So that was huge. Everybody had to sit back and wait till she had the baby to see if it was going to be a male heir, which would be king eventually, or girl. So they basically named Aridaeus as ruler. And it was a boy that she had, Alexander IV. They named them two as basically the rulers of the land, basically in name only, like they would be like symbolic rulers, like monarchy, you might as well say. But the power would basically lie with Perdiccas. And he would be the one who basically rules and really has the say-so on what takes place until Alexander IV became of age. So, of course, everybody's looking at Perdiccas as the true ruler. What he says goes. Of course, the other Diadochi, which you have to understand, you really have four main ones, but it's more who would later come into power. So we can't really stick to the main four, one being Ptolemy the First Soter and Perdiccas, of course. There's a lot more who would eventually come into power. And this whole war, this whole Game of Thrones, would take place. So understand again, you have now Perdiccas ruling. And now everybody's looking at Perdiccas, wanting that spot and paying attention to what he's doing and what's going on. The thing is, as I said, Game of Thrones type stuff has happened. You have to understand, you have now Aridaeus, who was the older half brother of Alexander the Great. They are both sons of Philip of Macedonia, who was basically ruling before. Now, what you have to understand is that Philip of Macedonia, his brother was the king, and his brother had a son. Now, of course, when the king dies, the prince rules. The heir is supposed to take over. That's how they was doing it in Greece. But, when Philip's brother died, his son was basically an infant, a baby, a child, so could not rule. So Philip of Macedonia became the regent, just like Perdiccas just became the regent. So you have Philip of Macedonia being the regent now, and the heir, waiting for the heir to come of age is what he's supposed to do, and then, turn over the kingdom to him. So basically, Philip of Macedonia was supposed to turn over the kingdom to his nephew, Amyntas. But instead of turning over the kingdom, what he did was declare himself king. Forget being regent. I'm going to declare myself king. And that's what he did. He declared himself king. Amyntas came of age, but Amyntas wasn't really, in a position to challenge the throne, even though he is rightfully his. He didn't really challenge it. He didn't really, care too much about it. He didn't really try to be a threat or a problem to Philip of Macedonia. He just basically conceded. And what Philip did was, when he had his daughter, he gave his daughter to his nephew. Remember, that's just how they do in these royal families, their bloodline. So he gave his daughter, Kenene, which a lot of you know who she is. We'll get into that in a second. Kenene, he gave Kenene to his nephew to basically marry her and basically go about their business. Now, the whole thing was Alexander was born, of course. Now, Alexander is coming up, and Alexander knows that he has basically somebody who can challenge him for the throne once his father dies. And he didn't like that. So he did what any, person would do in that position. He went and he killed her husband. And he basically promised her that he would give her another husband, a powerful husband someday. So he didn't want nobody to challenge him for the throne. So he went and killed his cousin. So now you have later, after Alexander dies, what happens was before he died, he promised his sister that, she would marry this powerful lieutenant. Oh, I forget his name, but he was a guy who really helped out Alexander throughout his whole rulership. And he was really loyal to Alexander, so he wanted to reward him with marrying his sister. But he got sick and he died before that could even happen. Now, again, we have fast forward to where now you have Perdiccas being the regent and running the kingdom in Alexander's place. So Kenene, who is a powerful warrior, she is very powerful, and she understands that, she would have been queen at some point and would have been ruling had her husband been alive and would have been able to take his place. So now she doesn't have a husband to step into that place or anything like that. So she focused her time on her daughter. Now, Kenene, as I said, was a warrior. She commanded armies. She was no joke. She defeated the Illyrian army and she killed the queen, with her own hands. Everybody knew about her. She was very well respected. Now, she had plans of her own. She had a daughter, Eurydice, who she wanted to marry to her uncle, who was the one who was slow, Aridaeus, who was her brother. So she wanted her daughter to marry her brother, which would be her uncle, her daughter's uncle. So her plan was to go ahead, take her daughter to Macedonia to marry her uncle, and basically she would have, some stake on the throne that was basically stolen away from her by her brother. So her proposal was she was going to go there, make it happen. And because she had respect and people liked her, it probably would have happened. So on her way there, of course, you had Perdiccas, who understood that if I let her, who is really a rightful heir to the throne, instill some kind of power in the kingdom, it would create problems for him. She would be watching his every move. So what he did was he went and sent his brother out to intercept her on her way there. And he ended up killing Kenene, who was a great warrior. He ended up killing her. Don't know exactly how, but he got the job done. And he killed her. So because she had so much respect, and a lot of people really respected her and revered her, and she was a good warrior, it kind of backfired on her because the council basically ruled that Eurydice, her daughter, could still go ahead and marry her uncle, Aridaeus. Even though he was slow, he wasn't that slow. He can, sort of comprehend a little bit, but he wasn't really mentally fit enough to run an entire kingdom. But she went on ahead and married her uncle. And they got married. And now, of course, she was basically, trying to really pull his strings and control his little bit of power that he did have, which, of course, she wanted him to have more power he had, she had. So this was her game to really try to get his level up and to get the council and the people to recognize that he is a true heir, even though he's slow. He deserves the respect of having more power than what he had. So Eurydice will eventually marry her uncle, Aridaeus. But Aridaeus would change his name to Philip III. So Aridaeus would become Philip III. He would marry his niece, Eurydice, and they would basically become a small power in the Macedonian Empire, which of course Perdiccas definitely feared and did not like. And he knew he had to eventually do something about that. So what happened was you had Perdiccas, who was sending out Alexander the Great's body. Now understand, this whole marriage and everything that happened, all this stuff happened within the same year Alexander died, the marriage and everything. So you had a little bit later, you had Perdiccas sending out the body of Alexander the Great to basically go be buried where he was crowned king. So right where he was crowned king, his body was supposed to be buried. But remember, as I said, the other Diadochi was against him, one of them being Ptolemy I Soter. What Ptolemy I Soter did was go and steal the body from the men who was transporting Alexander's body. So now after he stole Alexander's body, was buried in Alexandria, Egypt, which we know Ptolemy I Soter was the one who was crowned king or pharaoh of Egypt. So, of course, after he stole the body, Perdiccas wasn't having that. So he basically set up an army to basically go in and invade Egypt and start a war with Ptolemy I Soter. So here you have two of the Diadochi, two Greek warriors, soldiers in the army of Alexander who started the fight against each other, you know. And you had this war start to break out. The problem was Perdiccas wasn't as sharp as Ptolemy, and he was arrogant and he was crazy. So his battle plans, his military strategy was whack. He couldn't even cross the Nile and get into the main areas where he needed to strike. And his battle plans and his strategy was horrible. And every time his men failed, he would, execute them. He would treat them like crap. And eventually they got tired of it. So what happened was a few of his lieutenants, his leaders, came together and basically ended up killing him. So here you have the regent, basically almost the king almost, who is in place of Alexander. And this dude invades Egypt, which kind of pissed everybody else off. Then he wasn't even able to make a dent into Egypt. And he was basically killing off his own men because of his incompetence. And his generals and his commanders or what have you, they just didn't like it. It was disrespectful. And they basically came together and they ended up killing him. So basically one of those men, commanders, was Seleucus. And Seleucus would eventually get some land of his own and begin the Seleucid Empire. Anybody who does any research on ancient history know about the Seleucid Empire. You can't miss it.